Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com. A few months ago, the Biden administration released their Arctic Report Card. 2021 Arctic Report Card reveals a human story of cascading disruptions, extreme events, and global connections. Continued loss of ice, Arctic sea ice, a central vital sign of one of the most iconic indicators of global climate change, is continuing to shrink under warming temperatures. The loss of sea ice diminishes the Arctic's ability to cool the global climate. Similarly, the persistent melting of the Greenland ice sheet and other land-based ice is raising seas worldwide. This sounds really scary. Let's take a look now and see if anything they're saying is true. Arctic sea ice extent is almost exactly at the 1981 to 2010 median. Extent is higher than most of the last 20 years, and it's also higher than it was on this date in 1995. Melt so far this month has been second lowest on record after 1989. A comparison from the same date in 1995 shows extent is higher now than it was 27 years ago. 15 years ago at the Nobel Prize ceremony, Al Gore predicted an ice-free Arctic by the year 2014.
Another new study to be presented by U.S. Navy researchers later this week warns it could happen in as little as 7 years. 7 years from now. In the last few months, it has been harder and harder to misinterpret the signs that our world is spinning out of kilter.
But there's been no trend since the Nobel laureate made that forecast 15 years ago, and there's actually more ice now than there was at that time. Climate alarmists like to say now, Al Gore is just a buffoon. Nobody takes him seriously. If that's the case, they probably shouldn't have awarded him the Nobel Prize. Now let's look at the Biden administration's claims about melting of the Greenland ice sheet. Every year, the surface of the Greenland ice sheet gains ice for about 10.5 months, and then during their short summer, they get some melt. But the summer is very short, and there's always a lot more accumulation during the year than there is melt. On average, there's about 370 billion more tons accumulated than melts every year. Over the past 6 years, accumulation of ice on Greenland's surface has been well above the 1981 to 2010 average. The only recent year which was significantly below average was 2019, while 2017 and 2018 were well above average. The Biden administration claims that Greenland's surface is melting down, but data shows that they're not telling the truth. Greenland's largest glacier started growing around the year 2016 and has continued to grow. This is very different than the time from 1850 to 1950 when the glacier was retreating very rapidly. So far, the Biden administration is batting 0 for 2 with their claims of climate catastrophe. Let's take a look now at sea level. Over the past 20,000 years, sea level has risen about 120 meters or 400 feet. Almost all of that sea level rise occurred before 6,000 years ago. NASA claims that sea level is rising now about 3.5 millimeters per year. But once again, the Biden administration is not telling the truth. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration says sea level is rising at about half that rate of 1.7 or 1.8 millimeters per year. In fact, 90% of tide gauges shown in blue are rising at a rate lower than what NASA claims is the global average. Tide gauges which have a long-term data set like Atlantic City, New Jersey, show no acceleration over the last 110 years. If sea level rise were accelerating, we would see an upwards curvature, but that upwards curvature does not exist. A few years ago, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration made a series of 6 different forecasts for sea level rise, but the actual data has been staying below their lowest scenario. Now let's take a look at how NASA came up with their fake sea level rise data. 40 years ago, NASA showed that sea level rise greatly slowed after the year 1950. But NASA has since altered their data, and now they show an acceleration in sea level rise after the year 1960 instead of a slowing. NASA Climate engaged in the same fraud they always do. They altered the data to match the theory instead of doing it the correct way the other way around. This animation shows La Jolla, California in 1871 transitioning to the present. Note that there's no indication of sea level rise over the last 150 years. And what about extreme weather in the past? This is what St. Louis looked like on this date in 1896. The May 27, 1896 tornado outbreak was the third deadliest on record in the United States. There were at least 10 deadly tornadoes that day in the United States, including 4 Category F4 tornadoes. 2 days earlier, on May 25, 1896, there were 9 deadly tornadoes in the United States. On May 25, 1896, Michigan, Iowa, and Illinois were devastated by floods and tornadoes. This week in 1896 was probably the most violent tornado outbreak in U.S. history. But there was another tornado outbreak this week in 1917, which was almost as bad. 200 people were killed in a tornado in Illinois on May 25, 1917. And then 1 week later, there was another deadly tornado outbreak in 1917, which killed people in Missouri, Kansas, Michigan, and Kentucky. 50 years ago this week, India got up to 135 degrees Fahrenheit, and people were dying from the heat by the hundreds. And 100 years ago this week, Ukraine was in a desperate situation. After 1 year of record heat and drought, people were dying at a train station in the Ukraine from famine at a rate of 30 people per day. That same week, Paris had all-time record May heat. They got up to 95 degrees Fahrenheit. On May 24, 1922, it was 90 degrees in the Alps and glaciers were rapidly melting. It's not hard to imagine what they would say at the World Economic Forum if that was happening this week. They would state with 100% certainty that the weather was caused by humans. Also 100 years ago, it was reported by the U.S. Weather Bureau the Arctic was warming up and melting. There was a radical change in climatic conditions and hitherto unheard of high temperatures in the eastern Arctic. The American consul to Norway reported, "Many old landmarks are so changed as to be unrecognizable. Where formerly great masses of ice were found, there are now often moraines, accumulations of earth and stones. In many points where glaciers formerly extended far into the sea, they have entirely disappeared." Explorer Stephenson reported that the ice between the North Pole and Alaska was young, thin, moving, rotten ice. 1921 brought a record heat wave and drought which threatened millions of people with death. And that's exactly what was going on in the Ukraine this week 100 years ago. The first week of June in 1921 brought one of the deadliest floods in U.S. history to Pueblo, Colorado. Glacier National Park was melting so quickly that experts predicted all of the ice would be gone in just a few years. Let's finish this up with this week in 1935 when Texas received world's record rainfall. On May 31, 1935, Woodward Ranch, Texas received 22 inches of rain in 2 hours and 45 minutes. The record rainfall in Texas on May 31, 1935 broke the previous record which was set a few hours earlier in Colorado. On May 30, 1935, several locations in eastern Colorado got almost 23 inches of rain in 4 hours. The rain in eastern Colorado led to the deadliest floods in Nebraska history. That was Memorial Day 1935, and then there was Labor Day when the most intense hurricane in U.S. history hit. This train in the Florida Keys got blown 30 feet off the tracks by the wind. None of the claims in this Biden administration report have anything to do with science, climate, or history. Once again, this is simply corrupt politicians and corrupt academics defrauding the public. Toto has been pulling back the curtain on this fraud for the past 14 years. You can visit him, Curie, and Caesar on the web at realclimatescience.com.